They call it the Marco, not because it's a heroic summit point, not because it marks a safe route or a glorious achievement. They call it that because everyone knows exactly where it is, and everyone understands what it means. On the upper slopes of Everest, above the last scraps of kindness in the air, the mountain keeps certain things the way it wants them. Preserved, unchanging, and impossible to ignore. In that thin, brutal world, time doesn't behave like it does down below. A single hour can feel like a lifetime. A single mistake can become permanent. And sometimes, someone becomes a landmark. This story begins with a veteran explorer who has spent his entire life chasing places that don't forgive. He's calm under pressure, respected by teams, and the kind of man who doesn't speak much, because the mountain always speaks louder. But this season is different. The weather windows are narrowing, the crowds are thicker, the decisions are sharper, and the rumors are worse than usual. A still figure near a traverse line, a shape that seems too human to be a rock, too familiar to be ignored. At first he refuses to look, because everyone does. You don't stare at reminders up there. You don't slow down. You don't waste oxygen on grief. You focus on the next step, the next anchor, the next breath. That's the code. But when he finally sees it, when the headlamp beam catches fabric, frost, and the outline of a face that should not still be there, something inside him fractures. Not fear, not panic, recognition. And the moment he recognizes who Marco really is, the mountain shifts from a climb into a confession. Because Marco isn't just a tragedy frozen in place. He's a message, and the cold is not finished speaking yet. The story you just heard is a fictional narrative created for entertainment. Everest is often described as a trophy, a test, a dream. But the mountain doesn't care what we call it. It doesn't reward courage. It doesn't punish arrogance. It simply keeps taking, quietly, steadily, until it has what it wants. In this fictional story, you're going to follow an experienced explorer as he returns to Everest for what he believes will be a disciplined, controlled expedition. No drama, no ego, just the climb. But as the team moves higher, they discover something that's been turned into a reference point, spoken about in half sentences at base camp, avoided in photos, and never discussed out loud for too long. A landmark that wasn't built, a marker that didn't choose to stay, and a cold that refuses to release what it has claimed. As you listen, pay attention to the small decisions, the ones that feel harmless in warmth and comfort, but become life or death above 8,000 meters. Notice how quickly certainty collapses when oxygen is thin and every step has a cost. And ask yourself the question climbers hate the most. What would you do if the mountain forced you to choose between survival and humanity? If you enjoy immersive survival and exploration stories like this, stories built to keep you on the edge of your seat, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss the next chapter. And in the comments, tell me, what country are you watching from right now? I read as many as I can, and it's incredible to see how far these stories travel. Base camp had a way of pretending it was safe. The tents were bright and orderly, like a small festival dropped onto the dead grey ice. Radios crackled with familiar voices, stoves hissed, men and women laughed in short bursts that ended too quickly, as if even joy had to conserve oxygen. The Khumbu icefall groaned in the distance like a living thing turning in its sleep, and somewhere above the western Sidrabem, wind worried at the mountain's flanks with a patience that bordered on cruelty. Ethan Cole had been here before, 3 times, across 2 decades, enough to know that comfort at base camp was a staged performance, like warm lighting in a room that still smelled of smoke. You could drink tea and check your gear and talk about weather windows, but you were doing all of it at the foot of a machine designed to shred human plans into scrap. He sat on a folding chair outside his tent, cradling a metal mug between gloved hands. The tea tasted like boiled plastic and ginger. His eyes traced the icefall line the way a man might look at a scar that never quite stopped itching. "Cole," a voice called. He didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. He recognized the sound of a man who was trying to sound casual and failing. Victor Haldane approached with a clipboard tucked under his arm, a headset hanging around his neck like a stethoscope. Victor was expedition manager, mid-50s, tidy beard, calm smile, the sort of man who could say, "This is fine," while a storm tore a tent apart. He stopped a few paces away, boots crunching on the ice, and nodded toward the mountain. "Route team fixed most of Camp 1, Victor said. "Sherpa are happy with progress. Icefall doctors say it's stable enough for a push tomorrow morning." Ethan lifted his mug. "Stable enough," he repeated like he was tasting the words. Victor smiled thinly. "You know what I mean." Ethan knew what he meant. Stable enough meant it's dangerous but we're going anyway. Stable enough meant the mountain hasn't killed anyone today and we're hoping it stays in that mood for another 12 hours. "Teams ready?" Ethan asked. Victor checked his clipboard even though he already knew. "All green, except for Luca. He's fighting a cough. Says it's nothing." Ethan's gaze sharpened. Luca Ramirez was one of the younger climbers on this expedition, early 30s, Brazilian, lean and strong, with that restless energy some men carried like an electric current. Ethan had met him during acclimatization hikes. Luca talked about Everest the way people talked about their first love, with awe and impatience mixed together. A cough up here was never nothing. "Keep him watched," Ethan said. "If it turns, he stays down." Victor's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll tell him. Whether he listens is another matter." Ethan stood, joints stiff, and pulled his down jacket tighter. Around them, climbers moved like bright insects on the ice, checking ropes, adjusting straps, rehearsing motions that would soon need to be automatic. It would be easy to say Ethan was fearless. People liked that story. Veteran explorer, calm under pressure, eyes like granite. But he wasn't fearless. He just had a relationship with fear that was older than most of the men around him. Fear was a tool, a signal, a compass, and lately it had been pointing in one direction. The first time Ethan heard the name Marco on this expedition, it was in the mess tent. A heated, low-voiced conversation that stopped when he entered, like a radio suddenly cut off. He sat with his bowl of rice and lentils and listened without making it obvious. A French guide, Bastien, leaned across the table, speaking to a Nepalese climber in English. "I'm telling you, he's still there. Same place. You can see it if the light hits right." The Nepalese climber frowned. "People should not talk about that," he said quietly. Bastien scoffed. "Why? It's not magic. It's a fact." A British woman named Nadia, medical lead for another team, raised her eyes. "Stop," she said. "Not during dinner." Bastien spread his hands. "What we pretend it doesn't exist. Everyone uses it as a marker." Ethan's spoon paused mid-air. Marker. The older Sherpa at the end of the table didn't join the argument. He simply stared into his tea as if something in it had turned bitter. Victor, moving through the tent, caught Ethan's eye and shook his head slightly. Later, outside, Ethan walked toward the comms tent and found two Sherpa tightening a line near the ice edge. They spoke in Nepali. He didn't understand every word, but he understood the tone, respect mixed with unease, like men speaking near a grave. Ethan didn't ask. He rarely asked about the mountain's ghosts. You learned early that Everest collected stories the way it collected bodies, without apology. But that night, in his tent, with the wind snapping fabric like a whip, he found himself thinking about a single word. Marco. It sounded ordinary, too ordinary. A person's name turned into a point on a route. By morning, the decision to move was made, stable enough. Ethan's team left base camp before dawn, headlamps bobbing in a line. The air was so cold it felt sharp, like the inside of a freezer that had teeth. He moved deliberately, testing each step, listening to the hidden language of creaking ice. The Khumbu icefall greeted them with its usual indifference. Blue towers of ice stacked like shattered cathedrals, ladders thrown across yawning crevasses, ropes fixed into walls that could collapse without warning. Ethan's breath puffed into the beam of his headlamp. Each inhale carried that familiar dryness, like breathing through cloth. Behind him, Luca's breathing was louder than it should have been, but the younger man kept pace, eyes forward. "Cough?" Ethan asked without turning. Luca's voice came tight through his buff. "Fine, dry air." Ethan let it go for now. He focused on the ladder ahead. Two aluminum rails lashed together, spanning a crevasse so deep the headlamp beam couldn't find the bottom. Beneath the ladder, blackness swallowed sound. Ethan stepped onto it, crampons biting metal. Halfway across, the ladder flexed, groaning. His pulse didn't spike. He'd crossed hundreds of these, but today, as he reached the far side, he felt something else. Not fear. A small, strange certainty that something was waiting above. By late morning, they reached Camp 1. Tents sat on a sloping field of snow, anchored with ice screws and prayer. The western CWM rose above them, wide, deceptive, a bowl of trapped air that could be calm one moment and a wind tunnel the next. Ethan drank water, forcing it down. Hydration was discipline up here. People died because they forgot to drink. Luca sat nearby, mask off, cheeks flushed. His cough returned, two short hacks quickly smothered. Ethan watched him. "Tell me if it gets worse," Ethan said. Luca flashed a grin that tried to look brave. "I didn't come here to sit in a tent." Ethan didn't respond. He'd heard that line in many accents. It was always spoken by men who still believed willpower could beat physiology. That afternoon, they did a short acclimatization climb toward Camp 2. Just enough to load the body with altitude and remind the mind what suffering felt like. The sun in the western CWM was brutal, heat reflecting off snow so bright it hurt even through goggles. Sweat dampened Ethan's base layer, then chilled under his jacket when clouds shifted. By the time they returned to Camp 1, the wind had risen. The tents flapped. The mountain made its endless noises, distant cracks, low booms, groaning ice shifting under weight. Ethan lay in his sleeping bag, listening. In the adjacent tent, he heard Luca coughing again, longer this time. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore the thought that had started burrowing into his mind. A landmark, a marker, a name. The next day, they pushed to Camp 2. The route wound through the western CWM beneath the flanks of Lhotse and Nuptse, the walls rising on either side like frozen cliffs. Avalanches thundered periodically from the surrounding peaks, plumes of snow rolling down in slow-motion violence. But the route stayed far enough away to be considered acceptable. Acceptable. Ethan watched Luca closely. The young man moved well, strong legs, steady rhythm, but his breathing remained harsh, and the cough kept returning like a warning bell. At Camp 2, the tents were perched on a rocky patch called the CWM camp, surrounded by snowfields and towering ice. The air felt thinner, sharper, the sky seemed closer. That evening in the communal tent, a few climbers from different teams shared hot drinks, faces drawn in the yellow lantern light. Someone mentioned traffic above. Someone mentioned a storm line moving in from the west. And then, inevitably, someone mentioned the name Ethan had been hearing in half sentences. "Marco's still there," a climber said quietly, voice muffled by his balaclava. "Saw him last week on our rotation." A different climber, older, German, shook his head. "You don't see him. You glance and you move." Nadia, the British medic, spoke without looking up from her notes. "If anyone is having trouble sleeping, don't talk about it." Bastien, the French guide, couldn't help himself. "But it's insane. They're using him like a signpost. Turn left at Marco, like he's a rock." The tent fell silent. Ethan held his cup, feeling the heat seep into his gloves. Finally, he spoke. Not loudly, but his voice carried. Who was he? No one answered at first. The lantern hissed. Wind raked the tent. The German man cleared his throat. Nobody knows for sure. Or do some know and don't say? Bastian leaned forward, eyes bright in the dim light. They say he was an Italian climber, or Spanish. Some say he was a Sherpa. Some say he died 2 seasons ago, some say 10. But he's in a place everyone passes, and the cold keeps him. Like that. Ethan's jaw tightened. A body doesn't become a marker by accident. Nadia's pen paused. Everest turns everything into something, she said softly. A dream, a nightmare, a lesson, sometimes a warning. Ethan nodded once, then stood and left the tent. Outside, the night was a black ocean of stars. The Milky Way spilled across the sky like frost on glass. The mountain rose above them, invisible except where moonlight caught an edge of ice. Ethan walked a short distance from camp, far enough that voices faded. He stood alone and looked upward. He had promised himself something years ago, after a different expedition, a different loss. A vow made quietly, with the kind of seriousness only grief could carve. If he ever had the strength to help, he would. Not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a human being. The mountain didn't care about vows, but Ethan did. On the 3rd day, they climbed the Lhotse face. The route from Camp 2 to Camp 3 was a steep wall of blue ice, fixed ropes running upward in parallel lines. Climbers moved like slow beads, clipped in step by step, each motion careful because a slip could become a fall that the rope might not forgive. Ethan's calves burned, his lungs clawed at the air. He fell into the rhythm he knew well. Step, breathe, clip, step, breathe. The sound of his crampons biting ice was crisp and satisfying. Halfway up, Luca's breathing turned ragged. Ethan looked down. Luca had stopped. His head hung slightly. His gloved hand gripped the rope as if it was the only thing anchoring him to the planet. "You okay?" Ethan called. Luca lifted his head. Even through goggles, Ethan could see the strain. "Just need a second." Ethan wanted to insist they turn around. But turning around on the Lhotse face wasn't simple, and Luca, stubborn as a young man chasing a summit, would fight it. Ethan climbed down a few steps to be closer. "You're coughing more." "It's fine," Luca insisted, and then coughed hard enough that his shoulders jerked. Ethan felt the cold reality of what that could mean. High-altitude cough could be benign, dry air, irritation, but it could also be the first whisper of fluid in the lungs, the first hint of something that would become fatal if ignored. "Tell me the truth," Ethan said. "Any chest tightness?" Luca hesitated. That pause was an answer. Ethan's gaze hardened. "We're going down after Camp 3. No summit push until we know you're stable." Luca's eyes flared with frustration. "I didn't come here to be babysat." Ethan leaned closer, voice low enough that only Luca could hear. "Everest doesn't care what you came here for." For a long moment, Luca stared at him, anger and fear wrestling behind the goggles. Then Luca nodded once, barely. They continued upward. By the time they reached Camp 3, tents hammered into the slope, perched on a narrow ledge of snow and ice, the world felt stripped down to essentials. Breath, pain, decision. The wind howled. The temperature plunged as sun dipped behind the ridgeline. Ethan helped Luca into a tent, checked his oxygen saturation with a small device, and frowned. Too low. Not catastrophic yet, but wrong. Luca tried to joke. "So, I'm not dying yet." Ethan didn't smile. "Not if we're smart." They descended the next morning, a careful retreat down fixed ropes. Luca moved slowly, coughing often. Ethan stayed close, monitoring him like a hawk. It felt like escorting a man away from the edge of a cliff he didn't realize he'd been standing on. Back at Camp 2, Nadia met them with her medical kit. She listened to Luca's lungs, her expression tight. "He needs rest," she said. "And he needs to descend. Base camp, minimum. Luca started to argue, but the medic cut him off. This isn't negotiable. Ethan watched Luca's shoulders slump. A brokenness settled in him, not just physical, but emotional. Ethan recognized it. The grief of a dream interrupted. That night, the storm line Victor had mentioned arrived. Wind slammed the tents. Snow hissed across the surface like sand. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature sank so low that exposed skin would freeze in seconds. Ethan lay awake, listening to the violence outside, and thought about Marco. Somewhere above, maybe near the South Pole, maybe on a traverse line, someone's name had been reduced to coordinates. And now, with Luca being sent down, Ethan felt the mountain tightening its grip on the expedition, rearranging people like pieces on a board. In the morning, when the storm eased, Ethan stepped outside and saw footprints partially filled with blown snow. He looked up, and in the pale daylight, for the first time this season, he could see the route line clearly, tiny figures moving on it like dark ants against white. Victor's radio crackled in Ethan's pocket. He lifted it. "Cole?" Victor's voice came, tense. "We've got a situation up high." Ethan's heart tightened. "Where?" "Above Camp 3. One of the teams reported something. A climber slipped near the traverse line. They clipped in, but they're not responding." Ethan swallowed, feeling the cold sink deeper. "Alive?" Victor hesitated. "They don't know, but they said they're near that spot." Ethan's grip on the radio tightened. "Marco?" Victor's silence was confirmation. Ethan stared up at the mountain, at the thin line of route that vanished into clouds, and felt a familiar sensation settle over him. Not fear, purpose. "Tell me who's closest," Ethan said. Victor exhaled. "You are." Ethan didn't hesitate. He clicked off the radio and turned toward his tent, already reaching for his harness and gloves. Because whatever Marco was, whatever the mountain had turned him into, something had just happened near that place. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind ever could, that the mountain was about to demand a price. He stepped into his tent, pulled his gear close, and as his hands worked automatically, his mind kept returning to one thought. Quiet, relentless. If the cold doesn't let go, what will it take to make it? Ethan moved with the kind of speed that didn't look like rushing. Every action had a purpose. Every strap tightened the same way it always had. Every carabiner checked twice, not because he was nervous, but because nerves up here were expensive. He pulled on his harness, clipped his jumar, tested his headlamp even though it was daylight, and stuffed a spare balaclava into the pocket of his down suit. He added one extra oxygen canister to his pack and felt the familiar weight settle against his spine like a hard truth. Nadia met him outside the tent, her face half-covered, eyes sharp. "You're not a rescue team," she said, but her tone wasn't judgment. It was reality. "No one is up here," Ethan replied. Victor's voice crackled from the radio at Ethan's shoulder. "Closest report says the climber is still clipped to the fixed line, slipped on a bulge of ice near the traverse. They're hanging at an awkward angle. Team above tried yelling. No response." "How long ago?" Ethan asked. 30 minutes, maybe 40. Ethan's jaw tightened. 40 minutes at altitude, in wind, in partial suspension. Could mean anything from shock to hypoxia to something worse. He looked toward the route and saw tiny silhouettes moving, slow, uncertain. Above Camp 3, the mountain didn't offer flat ground to gather courage. You gathered it while clinging to a rope. Nadia stepped closer. "If you go with a partner." Ethan's eyes swept the camp. Most were either recovering from rotation or pinned down by the storm's leftovers. Then he saw Tenzin Sherpa, quiet, compact, the kind of climber whose movements seemed to blend with the mountain rather than fight it. Tenzin was checking a rope coil near a tent, hand steady. Ethan walked over. "Tenzin, come with me." Tenzin didn't ask why. He looked up at the line, then at Ethan's face. His eyes narrowed slightly, like he already understood the destination. "Near that place," Tenzin said, not a question. Ethan nodded. Tenzin's mouth tightened. "People talk, but mountain does not talk. Mountain shows." They began climbing within minutes, leaving Camp 2 behind like a warm memory. The wind had dropped, but not disappeared. It prowled along the slope, looking for gaps in clothing and weak points in tents. The Lhotse face rose above them, an angled wall of blue ice that reflected light like glass. The fixed ropes were taut and cold under their gloves. Ethan felt the strain of the altitude immediately, the shallow breath, the heavy legs. He switched his oxygen on low flow earlier than he normally would. If there was a rescue attempt, he wanted his mind as sharp as it could be. As they climbed, they passed other climbers descending. Faces pale, movement stiff, eyes avoiding Ethan's. One man tried to speak but only shook his head and continued downward. Another, a woman with frost on her lashes, stared at Ethan's extra canister and looked away quickly, as if seeing it made something too real. Ethan kept moving. Tenzin climbed slightly ahead, efficient and silent. Every few minutes he glanced upward, gauging wind, ice texture, traffic. They reached Camp 3 by midday, the tent still battered by the storm's earlier rage. The slope was steep enough that standing still felt like balancing on a roof. A small group of climbers huddled near the edge of camp, radios pressed close to their masks. Victor's expedition liaison, an American named Caleb, waved them over, his eyes wide. "They're up there," Caleb said, pointing toward the traverse line where the Lhotse face transitions into the route toward the South Col. "We heard the fall. It wasn't a big slide, more like they lost purchase and swung. They're still clipped. We tried calling, nothing." Ethan looked where Caleb pointed. The route above narrowed into an exposed line of snow and ice, with a drop that vanished into cloud. Wind teased spindrift from the ridge, making it look like the mountain was smoking. "How close to Marco?" Ethan asked. Caleb swallowed. "Close enough that people won't stop saying it." Ethan didn't answer. He and Tenzin clipped in and moved out of Camp 3. The traverse was always a psychological test. The slope angled away like a tilted floor meant to throw you off. Your crampon points bit into hard snow, and the fixed rope was the only promise between you and emptiness. Ethan leaned into the mountain, careful with every step. His breathing sounded loud inside his mask. Then around a slight rise, he saw them. A figure hung a few meters below the line, clipped in, body twisted at the waist. The harness held, but the position was wrong, like a puppet dropped mid-motion. The climber's head was angled down, chin pressed to chest. One arm dangled. The other was caught awkwardly near the rope. Ethan's gut tightened. He and Tenzin moved closer, testing the snow. Ethan reached the climber first and braced himself, planting his ice axe. The climber's suit was dark, navy and grey, stiff with frost. Their goggles were still on, but a rim of ice crusted the edges where breath had condensed and frozen. Ethan leaned in, voice loud. "Hey! Can you hear me?" No response. He touched the climber's shoulder. The fabric felt hard. Tenzin clipped into an anchor point and crouched, examining the harness connection. "If we pull wrong, rope can cut," Tenzin murmured. Ethan nodded. He reached under the climber's arm, trying to adjust the angle, and the climber's head shifted slightly. For a second, Ethan felt relief. Movement meant life. Then he saw the face behind the goggles. The climber's eyes were open, but they didn't track him. They were glassy, unfocused, like the person was looking through Ethan at something far beyond. A thin crust of ice clung to the corners of their lashes. Ethan's throat went dry. He tapped the climber's cheek through the balaclava fabric. "Listen to me. What's your name?" A faint sound came, so faint Ethan almost missed it. A breath, maybe, or a word. Ethan leaned closer. "Say it again." The climber's lips moved under the mask and a whisper slipped out, shredded by wind. "Don't look." Ethan froze. Not because of the words themselves. Plenty of people said strange things in hypoxia, but because the climber's gaze drifted past Ethan's shoulder towards something higher on the route, and the fear in their eyes sharpened for the first time. Tenzin followed the gaze. His posture changed in a way Ethan had seen before, like a man instinctively stepping away from a ledge. Ethan turned his head slowly, and there above them, just beyond a small ridge of snow where the route pinched tight, was a shape that didn't belong to rock or ice. A person, seated against the slope as if resting. A figure so still it looked carved, clothing faded by sun, stiffened by wind, dusted with snow that never melted, a hood pulled up, boots half buried, one gloved hand pressed against the chest as if holding something in place. Ethan's mind did what minds did to protect themselves. It tried to label the shape as anything else, a bundle of gear, a torn tent, a rock, but the human outline refused to be erased. Ethan felt his pulse thud inside his ears. Tenzin didn't speak. The hanging climber made another sound, half sob, half cough, and the rope trembled slightly. Ethan forced himself to look away from the seated figure. He focused on what was in his hands. A living person. Barely. He nodded to Tenzin. "We need to get them upright." Tenzin anchored a short sling and began a careful maneuver, adjusting tension to lift the climber's body and reduce the harness pinch. Ethan supported the torso, trying to bring the climber's feet back to the slope. The climber's crampons scraped ice weakly. "Push with your legs," Ethan ordered. "Just push." The climber's eyes blinked slowly. A tremor passed through their limbs. They tried, barely. Ethan's forearms burned as he hauled and steadied. Tenzin pulled with measured strength, using angles and leverage rather than brute force. Slowly, painfully, the climber's weight shifted, and their boots found a ledge of snow. For a moment, the climber stood. Their head lolled. Their knees threatened to fold. Ethan grabbed their harness straps. "Stay with me! Stay with me!" The climber's lips moved. "Marco!" Ethan's stomach dropped. Tenzin's voice came low. "They know!" Ethan didn't respond. He kept the climber pressed against the slope and checked their oxygen regulator. It was on, but the flow was too low. Or the mask seal was leaking. Or the climber's lungs were simply failing. Ethan made a decision without announcing it. He unclipped the extra canister from his pack and began swapping it onto the climber's line, hands clumsy with cold. Tenzin watched, eyes narrowing. "That is your spare," Tenzin said. Ethan snapped the connection in place. "Now it's theirs." The climber's breath hitched as richer oxygen filled the mask. Their shoulders rose, then steadied slightly. Their eyes blinked again, this time with something more present. Ethan leaned close. "Listen, we're going down. You walk if you can. If you can't, we drag you. What's your name?" The climber swallowed. Arjun, he rasped. "Arjun Patel." Ethan nodded. A name made the person real again. "Arjun, look at me. Don't look up." Arjun's gaze flicked upward anyway, drawn like a magnet. Ethan felt a flare of anger. At the mountain, at fate, at the fact that a dead man's presence could still harm the living. He shifted his body, blocking Arjun's view. Then the wind changed. A sudden gust tore across the traverse, blasting spindrift into their faces. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut against the sting of ice crystals. The fixed rope vibrated. Arjun flinched, and his footing slipped. Ethan lunged, grabbing the harness. And as he did, Arjun's body jerked, and the rope line above them snapped tight with a sharp, unnatural sound, like something had just taken weight that shouldn't have. Tenzin's head whipped upward. Ethan followed. The seated figure, Marco, had shifted. Not much, just enough to notice. A small slide of a shoulder, a tilt of the head. Impossible. Ethan's mind rejected it so violently it made him dizzy. But Tenzin saw it too. Ethan could tell by the way Tenzin's breathing changed, by the way his gloved hand tightened on the rope until his knuckles bulged. Arjun made a choked sound. He He moved. Ethan forced himself to speak, steady and harsh. It's the wind, the slope, nothing else. But even as he said it, Ethan's eyes fixed on Marco's hand. Something dark was tucked beneath it, something that wasn't ice or fabric. A strap, a small weathered object half hidden. A pack? No, too small. A pouch. Ethan didn't want to care. He didn't want curiosity to become a trap, but the human brain, starving for meaning, latched onto it like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. Tenzin pulled closer, voice low. "We go now." Ethan nodded and turned fully toward Arjun. "Move, one step at a time. Clip, step, breathe." Arjun tried. His legs trembled, but the oxygen helped. Ethan stayed beside him, one hand on the harness, the other on the rope. They inched along the traverse, every meter earned. Behind them, Marco remained in Ethan's peripheral vision like a stain on the world. They reached a slightly wider section of slope, just enough for Ethan to stop without feeling the mountain would push them off. He signaled Tenzin to hold tension, while Ethan adjusted Arjun's Jumar. That was when Ethan heard it, not from above, not from the wind, from the seated figure, a sound like fabric rubbing, like a zipper tugging against frozen teeth, or a glove dragging across ice. Ethan's head turned before he could stop it. Marco's hand was no longer pressed against his chest. It was resting on the snow beside him. And the small pouch, dark, battered, was visible now, wedged between Marco's hip and the slope, as if it had been protected from the worst of the wind. Ethan stared, unable to look away. There were things you didn't do on Everest. You didn't waste oxygen on sentimentality. You didn't unclip without reason. You didn't touch what the mountain had taken unless you were prepared to pay for it. But Ethan's vow, carved years ago by grief, stirred inside him like a living thing. If he ever had the strength to help. He looked at Arjun, swaying but standing. He looked at Tenzin, who was watching him now with an expression that wasn't fear exactly, more like warning. Ethan lifted his radio and spoke quickly. "Victor, we have Arjun. He's alive. We're bringing him down." Victor's voice came immediate, relief sharp. "Copy, good work, get him down, don't—" Victor paused, then said it anyway. "Don't do anything stupid." Ethan clicked off. The pouch sat there, silent. A part of Ethan's mind, cold and practical, said, "Leave it. There's no time. There's no oxygen. You're not here for artifacts or closure." Another part said, "That pouch might contain identification, a name, something that returns humanity to a person turned into a marker." Ethan heard himself speak, and it sounded like someone else's voice. "Tenzin, keep Arjun steady. I'm going 2 meters." Tenzin's eyes flared. "No! 2 meters!" Ethan insisted. "I'll be clipped in. Quick!" Tenzin's jaw worked as if he wanted to argue, but he glanced at Arjun's shaking legs and made a decision. He anchored Arjun tighter, bracing him against the slope. Ethan clipped in with a short tether, tightened it, and took a careful step upward toward Marco. The air felt suddenly heavier, as if the mountain itself was leaning closer to listen. Ethan reached the seated figure. Up close, the reality was worse. The clothing was sun-bleached. The face, partially visible beneath the hood, was waxy, pale, and distorted by time and cold. It wasn't gruesome in the way death often was down below. It was preserved, like a memory that refused to fade. Ethan swallowed hard and forced his eyes to the pouch. He reached for it. His glove touched the leather-like material, stiff with frost. And then, beneath his hand, he felt something that made his blood run cold. A vibration. Not from the wind, not from the rope. A faint, rhythmic tremor, as if something inside the pouch had just buzzed. Ethan froze, breath trapped in his mask, and in that second of stillness, a single thought struck him with terrifying clarity. Up here, nothing should still have power. He tightened his grip on the pouch anyway and pulled it free. The moment it came loose, Marco's head tilted again, just slightly. like a puppet responding to a string. Ethan jerked backward instinctively. His crampon point skidded on hard snow. The tether snapped taut, stopping him inches from sliding. His heart hammered so hard he tasted metal. Tenzin shouted something in Nepali. Arjun made a strangled sound, half scream. Ethan steadied himself and looked down at the pouch in his hand. There was a zipper line, and beneath the frost, a small stitched label, barely readable. Ethan wiped it with his thumb. A name emerged. Not Marco. Miss Caro. Ethan's mind raced. Ms. Caro, Marco, a nickname formed from a label, a man reduced to 2 letters and a landmark. He swallowed and started to zip the pouch open. The zipper resisted, frozen. He tugged again, harder. It opened with a sharp scrape, and inside, wrapped in plastic fogged by frost, was something rectangular. A phone. An old model, battered and cracked, sealed in a bag. Impossible. And yet there it was. Cold. Dead. Except Ethan could swear, with that earlier vibration still echoing in his palm, that it hadn't been completely dead a moment ago. Ethan didn't have time to process the how, because the wind changed again, harder this time, and somewhere above them, a deep crack rolled through the slope like thunder trapped inside ice. Tenzin's head snapped upward, eyes wide. "Move!" Tenzin shouted. Ethan didn't ask why. He shoved the pouch into his jacket and lunged back down toward Arjun, clipping and stepping with desperate precision. The crack became a roar. A slab of snow, heavy, compact, broke loose high on the face and began sliding toward the traverse line, gathering speed, turning the mountain into a moving wall. Ethan grabbed Arjun's harness. "Down! Now!" Tenzin yanked Arjun forward, forcing his legs to move. Arjun stumbled, nearly fell, then caught himself as the rope pulled. The avalanche slammed into the root behind them with a violent hiss and a dull, crushing weight. Snow sprayed around their bodies like white smoke. The rope jerked. The world became a blur of ice crystals, noise, and instinct. Ethan drove his ice axe into the slope, anchoring himself as the force threatened to sweep them sideways. Arjun screamed once, then choked on snow. Tenzin held the rope like it was a lifeline to existence itself. For long seconds, the mountain tried to peel them off. And then, as quickly as it began, it passed, leaving silence so sudden it felt like deafness. Ethan's chest heaved. He forced air in. He forced calm in. Arjun was on his knees, coughing violently but alive. Tenzin looked back up the route, eyes narrowed. Ethan followed his gaze. The seated figure was gone. Not buried, not half-covered. Gone. Where Marco had been, there was only a scuffed patch of snow and a shallow groove like something had slid away into the cloud. Ethan's mouth went dry. He opened his radio with shaking fingers. "Victor, we're moving down now." Victor's voice came strained. "Copy. Report says the slab hit the traverse. Anyone missing?" Ethan looked at the empty spot again, the groove leading into whiteness, and answered with a voice that didn't sound like his own. "Nothing that anyone will admit is missing." He tightened his grip on Arjun and forced him to stand. They began descending toward Camp 3, step by step, clipped in, breathing hard, while Ethan felt the pouch against his chest like a beating heart. Because inside that frozen bag was a phone that shouldn't exist up here, and Ethan couldn't escape the thought that as soon as he got low enough for signal, it might do the one thing it was never supposed to do again. It might turn on. Camp 3 felt smaller on the way down, as if the mountain was tightening the walls around them. Arjun's descent was ugly but possible. He moved like a man learning to walk in someone else's body, stiff knees, trembling calves, hands locked onto the fixed rope as if it were a railing in a burning building. Ethan stayed close enough to catch him if he folded, one hand always hovering near Arjun's harness buckle. Tenzin moved behind them, efficient and silent, scanning above and below with the alertness of someone who had seen slopes break without warning. When they finally clipped into the camp anchors and stepped onto the tiny ledge where the tents clung to ice, Caleb rushed forward, eyes wide. "He's alive?" Caleb asked, like he needed to hear it from a mouth that wasn't shaking. Arjun tried to answer but coughed instead. Nadia pushed in, already pulling her stethoscope from inside her jacket like a gun drawn in a duel. "Inside," she ordered. "Now." Ethan helped Arjun into the nearest tent. Nadia listened to Arjun's lungs for a long, tense minute, then looked up with a face that didn't soften. "He's not clear," she said. "Crackles low. He needs to descend. Today. Base camp. Oxygen on the way if necessary." Arjun's eyes flared with weak protest. "I can—" "No," Nadia cut in. "You can't. And if you argue, you'll do it while walking down." Ethan saw the truth in Arjun's gaze. The fear wasn't only of failure. It was of becoming another story people spoke about in half voices. Of becoming a reference point. Nadia glanced at Ethan's chest. "You're shaking." "I'm fine," Ethan lied. Tenzin stood in the doorway, snow-caked on his boots, his expression carved from restraint. "That place is empty," he said quietly. Nadia's eyes narrowed. "What place?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He reached inside his down suit, fingers finding the stiff pouch he'd stuffed against his base layer. The cold had made it rigid, like it was made of frozen leather. He pulled it out and placed it on the tent floor between them. Nadia stared at it as if it were a live animal. "What is that?" she asked. Ethan's voice came low. It was under him. Tenzin's eyes flicked to Ethan, then away. "You touched," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact that had consequences. Ethan ignored the tone and unzipped the pouch carefully. The cracked device inside was sealed in a plastic bag, fogged with frost. In the dim tent light, it looked like nothing, just a broken relic, but the weight of it in Ethan's mind felt enormous. Nadia crouched, peering closer. "That's not a normal phone," she said. "Looks like a satellite device, older model." Ethan swallowed. "It shouldn't still be here." Nadia's gaze lifted. Neither should he. A silence settled, filled only by Arjun's labored breathing. Then Victor's voice crackled through Ethan's radio from outside, muffled by fabric. "Cole, update." Ethan stepped out of the tent, radio pressed close. Wind cut across the slope, biting at exposed skin. "Arjun's alive," Ethan said. "Not good, but alive. Nadia wants him down now." Victor exhaled, relief and tension mixed. "Good. Bring him to Camp 2. We'll coordinate from there." Ethan hesitated, eyes flicking upward toward the route that vanished into cloud. "Victor, the body near the traverse." A pause. "Marco?" "It's gone," Ethan said. There was a longer silence this time, one of those silences that meant someone was choosing words very carefully. "Gone how?" Victor asked. "After the slab. The spot is empty." Victor's voice dropped. "Cole, did you do something?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I took a pouch from under him. It has a satellite device inside. I thought it might identify him." Victor swore softly. "You know the rules up there." "Rules don't matter if we're turning people into signposts," Ethan snapped, and immediately regretted the sharpness. Victor's tone cooled. "Get down to Camp 2. We'll talk. Don't make any more decisions alone." Ethan clicked off and stood in the wind, feeling the mountains stare like weight on the back of his neck. Above Camp 3, the Lhotse face shimmered with hard light. Somewhere higher, a body, if it had been real and not a trick of hypoxia, had been swept away into the white. He didn't tell himself it was supernatural. He couldn't afford that. He told himself the wind, the slab, the angle of the slope, everything that was brutally ordinary up here had done what it always did. It moved what it could move, and it kept what it wanted to keep. They started down within the hour. Arjun descended, clipped between Ethan and Tenzin like fragile cargo. Nadia insisted he stay on oxygen, and she walked close, watching him like a hawk. Every few minutes she shouted a question. "Dizzy? Vision? Fingers?" Arjun answered with nods or brief rasped words. The western CWM spread below them like a wide, bright trap. By the time they reached Camp 2, the sun was dropping behind Nuptse, and cold shadow rolled into the valley like water flooding a basin. Tents glowed faintly from headlamps inside. Stoves hissed. Radios popped and crackled with updates from above. The mountain never stopped talking when you knew how to listen. Victor met them at the edge of camp, his face tight with controlled urgency. He looked Arjun over, nodded to Nadia. "Get him stabilized, then move him down." Nadia didn't wait for permission. She dragged Arjun toward the medical tent with 2 Sherpa assisting. Victor's eyes swung to Ethan's chest pocket. "You still have it." Ethan pulled the pouch out. Victor stared at it as if it were evidence at a crime scene. "You realize," Victor said, voice low, "if any team hears you remove something from a body, you'll have every moral philosopher at base camp calling you a thief and every pragmatist calling you an idiot." Ethan didn't flinch. "I'd rather be called both than pretend he's not a person." Victor's jaw worked, frustration fighting with something else. Maybe empathy. "What's inside?" Ethan opened the pouch. Victor leaned in. "Satellite messenger," he murmured. "Old. Rugged. Why would someone keep it under—" Victor stopped. He was thinking about the same thing Ethan was thinking. Why protect it? Ethan's fingers were numb, but he worked the plastic bag open carefully. The device's casing was cracked. The screen was black. The power button was stiff with cold. Nadia emerged from the medical tent, wiping her hands. "Arjun's headed down with 2 Sherpa," she said, then saw the device. "You're going to turn that on?" "If there's anything left," Ethan said. Nadia's expression held warning. "If it works and it contains personal data, it becomes a whole other problem." Victor gave a short, humorless laugh. "Everything becomes a problem on Everest." Ethan pressed the power button. Nothing. He pressed again, longer this time, thumb aching. For several seconds, the device remained dead. Then, so faint Ethan thought he imagined it, the screen flickered. A dim symbol appeared. A battery icon, nearly empty, trembling like a dying heartbeat. Victor sucked in a breath. Nadia's eyes narrowed. "It has charge," Victor whispered. "How?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know. Cold should have killed it. Time should have killed it. But something had kept it alive. Barely. A progress bar crawled across the screen as the device tried to wake. Then letters formed, slow, pixel by pixel, a welcome screen, an old model logo, and beneath it, a notification count, 1 unsent message. Ethan's pulse hammered. Nadia leaned closer. "Unsent," she said. "That's different from received." Victor's mouth went dry. "Open it." Ethan's gloved finger hovered over the button. For a moment he hesitated, feeling as though he was about to read a confession that belonged to someone who couldn't say no anymore. Then he pressed. The message opened slowly, as if the cold resisted memory. A timestamp appeared first. Ethan stared at it because the date didn't fit his brain at first. May 18th, 2016. A decade earlier. Victor's voice came hoarse. 10 years. Nadia swallowed. "Read it." Ethan scrolled. The message was short, written in the clipped language of someone conserving battery, conserving oxygen, conserving life. "If you find this, don't bring me down. Don't make me a burden. But don't leave the truth up here. The fixed line was moved. We were told it was safe. It wasn't. Not an accident. Follow the red tag at the traverse. MC." Ethan's stomach tightened as if someone had wrapped a rope around it. Victor stared, eyes wide, then shook his head slowly. "Not an accident." Nadia's voice dropped. "This could be delirium, hypoxia, paranoia." Ethan read it again, forcing himself to stay clinical. It wasn't rambling. It wasn't nonsense. It was deliberate. It was coherent. A red tag at the traverse. Ethan looked up at Victor. "Do you know anything about a red tag?" Victor's face was pale. "Route has tags sometimes, markers for anchors, old gear. Nothing official." Tenzin, who had been silent, spoke from behind them. "Red tag means warning." he said quietly. Sometimes Sherpa tie red cloth when line is bad. Some listen, some do not. Ethan felt the mountain close around them again. Not physically. Camp 2 was wide and the sky was open, but mentally like a trap tightening. Marco, Ethan said slowly, tasting the word. It wasn't a nickname, it was initials, MC. Victor's gaze snapped back to the screen. M. Caro. He remembered the stitched label Ethan had read. Could be a surname. Could be Caro, Carlo, Carver, anything. Nadia straightened. If this is real, it suggests sabotage or negligence, but you can't take a decade-old unsent message and turn it into an investigation at 8,000 meters. Victor rubbed his face, the way a man did when the options were all bad. And if it's true? Ethan's mind flashed images, crowds on the Hillary step in recent years, bottlenecks, oxygen running low while people waited on a knife-edge ridge. A moved, fixed line could kill not one climber, but many. "Where is this traverse tag?" Ethan asked, already knowing the answer. Victor exhaled. "Near where you found him. Near where he was now gone." Nadia stepped closer, voice firm. "Ethan, you've done your part. You saved Arjun. This device needs to go to base camp. It needs to be handled properly." Victor nodded, but Ethan could see Victor was torn. Victor was an organizer, a manager. He thought in risk assessments and liability and logistics, but he was also a climber who knew the mountain didn't care about paperwork. Ethan looked down at the device again. The message wasn't asking to be rescued. It was asking to be heard. "Tonight," Ethan said quietly, "the weather's stabilizing. The storm line moved through. If there's a window, teams will push. Crowds will be worse than ever. If there's a hazard at the traverse, if the line was moved and left wrong, someone could die on it tomorrow." Nadia's eyes hardened. "Or you could die trying to play detective." Tenzin's voice came calm, but it carried weight. "Truth is heavy," he said, "like stone in pocket. If you carry it too high, it pulls you down." Ethan looked at each of them, then back up at the darkening slope toward Camp 3. The mountain's outline sharpened against the stars, beginning to prick through the sky. He thought of Luca, already descending sick, his dream cracked like thin ice. He thought of Arjun, alive only because a stranger refused to ignore him. He thought of a man, MC, who had become a landmark because the cold did not let go. And he thought of that unsent message, waiting 10 years in silence. Victor's voice softened. "What do you want to do, Ethan?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He knew the sensible choice: bring the device down, report it, let authorities and route managers and politics swallow it. But the sensible choice didn't keep people alive tomorrow. "I want one look," Ethan said. "Not a recovery, not a hero mission. I want to find the red tag, confirm the line. If there's something wrong, we warn every team we can." Nadia shook her head. "You're talking about going back up after what just happened." I'm talking about preventing what could happen," Ethan replied. Victor stared at him for a long moment, then glanced toward the route. "If you go," he said, "you go with Sherpa support. You go fast. You come back before the window opens fully." Tenzin's eyes narrowed. "Many people will be on ropes soon. If line is wrong, they will trust it." "They always trust rope." Ethan nodded once. "Then we don't have time." That night, while the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Ethan lay in his tent with the satellite device beside him. The screen dimmed, the battery icon nearly empty again. He stared at it in the darkness, listening to the wind scrape snow across fabric like fingers across paper. He didn't dream much on the mountain. Sleep here was shallow, fractured, more like blackouts than rest. But when he drifted, he saw a seated figure above a traverse line, hood up, hand on chest, and when the wind hit, the head tilted as if listening. He woke with his heart pounding and forced himself to breathe slowly, counting his inhales like steps. At first light, Ethan was already clipped into his harness. Victor met him outside, eyes red from lack of sleep. "Weather's holding," Victor said, "but it won't hold long." Nadia stood nearby with a tight mouth. She didn't try to stop him again. Instead, she handed him a small packet. "Dexamethasone," she said, "in case you get stupid symptoms and can't admit it." Ethan took it. "Thank you." Tenzin was there, rope coil over his shoulder, expression unreadable. Ethan glanced at the device in his pocket. The screen was off now, dead again, maybe for good. But the message had already done what it needed to do. It had gotten inside Ethan. They started upward. The climb back to Camp 3 felt steeper than it had the day before, as if the mountain had shifted its angle just to remind them who was in charge. Ethan's legs were heavy. His breathing came harsh and loud. He kept his oxygen low, but steady, unwilling to gamble clarity for pride. By the time they reached Camp 3, other teams were stirring, preparing for pushes, adjusting gear, talking in short, urgent bursts. Ethan saw faces turn toward him, curious, wary. Rumors traveled faster than avalanches. He didn't stop to explain. He and Tenzin moved straight past the tents and onto the traverse. The spot where the slab had hit was obvious now. Fresh debris hardened into uneven lumps. The route line was still there, but snow had plastered it in places. Ethan's stomach tightened as they approached the section where Marco had been. He told himself again. The body was swept away. The movement was wind and hypoxia. The vibration was imagined. Stay rational. Then they rounded the rise. The scuffed patch of snow was still visible. So was the groove leading into cloud. But something else was there now, too, hanging from the fixed rope, fluttering lightly in the wind like a wound that refused to close. A strip of fabric, red. Tenzin stopped so abruptly Ethan nearly collided with him. Tenzin reached out slowly, touched the red tag with 2 fingers, and let it flap back. His eyes lifted to Ethan, and in them Ethan saw not superstition, but the cold certainty of a man who understood warnings the way climbers understood thin air. "This is not old," Tenzin said. Ethan's throat went dry. "What do you mean?" Tenzin pointed to the knot. "Fresh tie. Recent." Ethan stared at the red tag, heart hammering. If it was recent, then MC's message wasn't only history. Someone had been here. Someone had marked this. And then, as Ethan leaned closer to inspect the rope line beneath the tag, he saw what the red cloth was trying to draw attention to. A subtle cut in the fixed rope's sheath, small, precise, like a blade had kissed it and stopped. Not enough to snap immediately, but enough that under heavy weight, under traffic, under cold tension, it could fail. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Below them, the first climbers of the day began moving onto the traverse, clipped in, trusting the rope with their lives. Ethan grabbed his radio with shaking fingers, but before he could speak, the fixed rope above them gave a faint, ominous creak, like fibers tightening under stress. And Ethan realized with sickening clarity that the mountain wasn't waiting for tomorrow. It was ready to collect today. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, and at that exact moment, the line jerked hard, as if someone above had slipped and loaded the rope with sudden weight. The cut section stretched. The sheath split another millimeter, and the red tag snapped wildly in the wind, like a flag screaming without sound. Ethan's voice finally tore free, raw and urgent. "Stop! Don't load the line!" But the climbers below were already committed, already moving, already trusting. And Ethan knew he had seconds to do something, before the rope decided who would become the next landmark. Ethan's shout tore across the traverse like a flare in a blizzard. "Stop! Don't load the line!" For a fraction of a second, nothing changed, because on Everest, sound doesn't travel the way you want it to. Wind steals words, masks swallow urgency, and climbers, clipped in and committed, often move as if the rope itself is the only language that matters. Then a helmeted figure below looked up, confused. Another paused mid-step, Jumar biting the rope. A third kept coming, eyes fixed on boots, because looking up meant losing balance. The cut section of fixed line creaked again. Ethan could see it now with brutal clarity, a clean, shallow slice through the sheath, not frayed from rock abrasion, not worn from seasons of sun. It was too precise, too deliberate. Tenzin's gloved hand shot out and grabbed the rope above the red tag, bracing it as if his grip could become a clamp. His eyes snapped to Ethan. "Anchor," Tenzin said. Ethan was already moving. He drove his ice axe into the slope, then screwed an ice anchor into hard snow with numb fingers, the metal biting and squealing faintly as it threaded into the mountain. He clipped a locking carabiner, built a quick equalized point, and tugged it hard. It held. He looked down again. The climbers below were still coming, 3, maybe 4, stacking into the same section where the rope had been compromised. If even one slipped and shock-loaded that cut, the line could fail like a bad stitch tearing open. Ethan ripped his radio from his chest strap. "Victor, emergency on the traverse above Camp 3. Fixed line is cut. Repeat, cut. Stop all movement. Hold teams at Camp 3 and below." Victor's voice hit back instantly sharp. "Cole, say again. Cut." "Cut," Ethan said. Deliberate. "We've got a red tag warning. If that line loads, it could snap." A beat of silence. Victor processing the weight of what Ethan had just said, the way a man realizes the floor beneath him might not exist. Then Victor barked. All teams. This is Expedition Control. Hold position. Stop ascending the Lhotse face. Do not enter the traverse. Repeat, hold." Radios across the slope erupted in overlapping voices, accents colliding, panic edging into professionalism. Some demanded clarity, some argued, some cursed. A few simply said, "Copy," like soldiers. Below, the nearest climber finally heard enough to freeze. He clipped in, planted his axe, and pressed himself into the slope. His goggles tilted upward toward Ethan, and Ethan could see the question in his posture. What do we do now? Ethan pointed hard, signaling them to stay back. Then he turned to Tenzin and yanked a spare rope coil from his pack. "We bypass," Ethan said. "We give them a safe line that doesn't touch this section." Tenzin nodded once. No hesitation, no argument, because Sherpa didn't need drama to understand consequences. Ethan threaded the spare rope through his anchor, tying a figure 8 with fingers that felt like wood. He cinched it tight, then clipped it to the fixed line above the cut section, creating a redundant safety path. He tested it with his body weight, letting it load slowly, gently, the way you'd test ice before stepping fully on it. It held. He radioed down again, voice controlled but urgent. "New safety line is in, 1 at a time. No shock loads. Stay clipped. Slow, slow." The climber below nodded, though Ethan wasn't sure the man could see it. Then the first climber began moving upward toward Ethan's anchor point, carefully transferring from the main fixed line to Ethan's backup. Halfway through the transfer, a gust slammed the slope. Spindrift blinded them. The climber's foot skittered on hard snow. A tiny slip, but enough. The climber's weight hit the rope in a sudden jerk. Ethan's anchor groaned. The carabiner snapped taut. For a heartbeat, Ethan felt the mountain test him, like a hand squeezing a weak joint. Then the anchor held. The climber regained footing, breathing hard, and continued, slow and shaking. Ethan didn't exhale until the man was past the cut section. One down. But below, there were more than Ethan had realized. A cluster had formed near the traverse entrance, held back by the radio call, but they were already clipped in, already burning oxygen, already impatient because every second up here was money, pain, and risk. Victor's voice returned, strained. "Cole, I've got multiple teams stacked at Camp 3. They're asking if they should retreat or wait." Ethan looked at the cut again and felt anger flicker through the cold. "They wait," Ethan said, "and we fix this. Tell them if anyone pushes onto the traverse, they endanger everyone." Tenzin leaned closer to the compromised rope. He ran his fingers along the sheath with the careful touch of a surgeon. Then he pointed to something Ethan hadn't noticed at first. Tiny flecks of dark material near the cut, embedded like grit. Not rock, Tenzin murmured. Knife. Maybe. Ethan's jaw tightened. Someone did this. Tenzin didn't look surprised. Sometimes people cut rope to steel, he said. Sometimes to remove old line. But this is not removal, this is trap. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. He glanced uphill, scanning the route above them. The line disappeared around the ridge toward the South Col. Empty now, no climbers visible. Whoever had done this might be gone, or might be watching. Ethan forced his mind back to the immediate problem. Keep the living from dying. He built a second anchor farther back, creating a stronger redundancy, then clipped his spare rope into a new angle so climbers could bypass the compromised section without crossing directly under it. Each knot felt like fighting with gloves made of stone. Each breath tasted thin, metallic. As the next climber transferred onto Ethan's backup, the man's eyes met Ethan's for a moment. Wide, frightened, grateful. Ethan recognized that look. It wasn't hero worship. It was the look of someone realizing they had almost trusted the wrong thing with their life. By the time the fourth climber passed, Ethan's legs trembled from holding position on the steep slope. His oxygen hissed steadily, and he checked the gauge. Lower than he wanted. Tenzin glanced at Ethan's regulator. "We cannot do many," he warned. Ethan nodded. "We do enough." Then, from below, a voice shouted, muffled but loud through the wind. A climber had lost balance at the traverse entrance. Ethan's head snapped down. The man was on one knee, Jumar locked, but his partner had stumbled into him. Their ropes tangled briefly, and for a terrifying second, both bodies leaned away from the slope like pendulums, trying to pull the line tight. Ethan's heart slammed. If they shock-loaded the fixed line below the cut, the tension could travel upward and finish what the blade had started. Ethan screamed again, voice raw. "Separate, one at a time." Tenzin moved faster than Ethan thought possible. He slid down a few meters, clipped into a lower anchor, and physically separated the two climbers, pushing one back with a firm hand and barking something in Nepali and English. The tangle resolved. The climbers steadied, breathing like frightened animals. The mountain had tested them again, and Ethan knew if they made one more mistake, the next test would be final. He radioed Victor, forcing calm into his voice. "Victor, you need someone at Camp 3 controlling the flow. No clusters, no pairs. One climber only onto the traverse at a time." "Copy," Victor snapped. "I'll put Caleb on it." Ethan's fingers were stiff, but he worked on the damaged rope now, wrapping it with tape, then adding a protective sleeve from spare cordage, reinforcing it enough to reduce immediate failure. It wasn't a perfect repair. It wasn't meant to be. It was a temporary bandage on a wound that should never have existed. When he finished, he leaned close to the red tag. The knot was indeed fresh, fibers not weathered, cloth not sun-bleached. Someone had tied it recently, not 10 years ago. The message from 2016 had warned of a moved line, a dangerous traverse, a red warning. This tag was the same language. Either someone had known and marked it, or someone was trying to recreate the warning, weaponize it, and turn the mountain into an executioner. Ethan's mind flashed back to the movement he thought he saw near Marco. The head tilt, the hand shifting. He forced logic into the memory. Wind can rock a body, especially if it's wedged on a slope. A rope tightening can jostle frozen limbs. A slab avalanche can shift the entire platform beneath a body and make it seem like the dead moved. And the phone, vibration. A tactile illusion, gloves numb, nerves fooled by cold, a device booting with a faint click or internal motor twitch. He held on to that explanation like a rope in darkness, because the alternative, believing the mountain was speaking through the dead, was the beginning of panic. By late morning, most teams had backed away from the traverse, held at Camp 3 or descending to Camp 2 to save oxygen and nerve. Victor's radio traffic was constant, trying to keep order among people whose bodies were screaming at them to keep climbing while their minds were being asked to wait. Ethan and Tenzin made a final check on the anchors, then began the slow return to Camp 3. Ethan's lungs burned. His legs felt carved from lead. He tried not to look at the empty, scuffed patch of snow where the body had been, but his eyes found it anyway. Only the groove remained, a shallow track leading into whiteness, and beside it, half buried in wind-blown snow, something dark caught the light. Ethan stopped. Tenzin noticed immediately. What? Ethan took 2 careful steps toward the edge of the groove, staying clipped. He reached down and brushed away snow. A piece of fabric, navy and grey, a torn sleeve. It wasn't ancient. It wasn't weathered like a decade-old relic. It was fresh. Ethan's throat tightened. He looked farther down the groove, into the cloud, and for the first time he allowed himself to imagine what the slab had done. A body, frozen stiff, could slide like a log. It could vanish into the crevasse fields below. It could become unrecoverable in seconds, but the sleeve wasn't from that body. It was from a living climber. Arjun. Ethan's mind snapped back. Arjun had been hanging here, twisted, frost-crusted. He had said, "Don't look." He had looked up and panicked. He had screamed Marco like a curse. In the avalanche chaos, something could have torn. Ethan's stomach clenched at the thought that even after saving Arjun, the mountain might still be collecting pieces of him. Tenzin touched the sleeve lightly, then shook his head. "Not important now," he said softly. "We must go down." Ethan nodded, swallowing the emotion that rose like bile. Survival came first. Grief came later, if you lived long enough to feel it. At Camp 3, Caleb met them, breathless with relief. "Controls in place," he said. "Most teams backed off. A few are still arguing, but they'll listen. No one wants to be the reason." Ethan looked across the tents. Faces watched him, some with gratitude, some with suspicion. And some, he noticed, wouldn't meet his eyes at all. He clipped off his gear and sat on a pack for a moment, forcing himself to breathe steadily. Nadia's voice crackled through the radio from Camp 2. "Ethan, status?" "Traverse stabilized," Ethan replied. "Temporary bypass and reinforcement. The line needs full replacement before any serious push." Victor's voice cut in. "We're shutting down summit attempts until the route is rebuilt. I don't care who complains." Ethan felt a small, bitter relief. At least for today, the mountain wouldn't get a crowd. Then Victor added, quieter, "Cole, that device. Bring it down. Now." Ethan looked at the satellite messenger in his pocket, the battery likely dead again. But the message had already lit a fuse. "I'm bringing it," Ethan said. The descent to Camp 2 was slow but steady. The western CWM glared under midday sun, making the snow almost blinding. Ethan's mind replayed details obsessively. How clean the cut had been, how fresh the tag, how the message from 2016 had lined up too well with what he'd found. At Camp 2, Victor was waiting. He pulled Ethan into the comms tent, away from curious ears. Nadia joined them, arms crossed. Tenzin stood at the entrance like a guard, not for Victor's authority, but for Ethan's safety. Victor set the satellite device on a small folding table, as if it were radioactive. "We're documenting everything," he said. "Photos, timestamps, radio logs. I've already contacted the route manager and the liaison officer. This gets handled officially." Ethan nodded. "Good." Victor studied him. "You realize this could ruin a season, could ruin reputations." Ethan's eyes didn't move. "If someone cut that rope, they already ruined more than a season. They tried to ruin lives." Nadia leaned in. "Arjun's descending. He'll reach base camp today. He's stable on oxygen, but shaken. He kept saying he thought he saw someone sitting above him." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Hypoxia and fear," he said, even though the memory still clung to him. "A body can shift in wind." Nadia watched him closely, like she was looking for cracks. "You believe that?" Ethan took a long breath. "I have to." Victor cleared his throat. "There's more," he said, and pushed a printed sheet across the table. It was a list, names, permits, records from 2016, pulled from expedition archives at base camp. One name was circled, Matteo Caro. Ethan stared at it. MC the label, the landmark name twisted into Marco over years of whispers. Victor spoke quietly. Matteo Caro vanished near the Lhotse Traverse in 2016, officially listed as an accident during a rope transition. His team said weather and traffic caused confusion. No body was recovered. Ethan's throat tightened. But he left a message saying it wasn't an accident. Victor nodded grimly. "Which means someone might have known the line was wrong, or moved it, or lied afterward." Nadia's voice dropped. "Or Matteo believed that, because he needed someone to blame in his final minutes." Ethan didn't flinch at the possibility. "Then why is there a fresh red tag now, and a fresh cut?" Silence answered him. Not because they didn't have theories, because every theory had teeth. Victor rubbed his temple. "We'll interview everyone who was near that section," he said. "We'll check rope inventories, toolkits, anything. But Ethan, you understand the truth here is messy. There are politics, there are permits, there are businesses." Ethan leaned forward, eyes hard. "And there are lives." Victor held his gaze, then nodded once. "Yes, that's why we shut it down." That night, as the temperature dropped and the camp quieted, Ethan stepped outside his tent and looked up at the mountain. The stars were sharp, the sky enormous, as if the world below had been erased. He thought about Matteo Caro, how a man could become a landmark because the cold refused to return him to the earth. How people could walk past him for years, using him as a navigational point, while never saying his real name. Ethan also thought about the cut rope. Someone, whether in 2016 or now, had treated the mountain like a place where consequences could be hidden by weather and time. But today, for once, the mountain had failed to keep the secret, not because it wanted to, because a warning had survived. A message preserved in a device that should have died, carried down by a man who refused to pretend a frozen figure was just a marker. In the morning, as teams descended and base camp grew busier with talk, Victor's shutdown order spread. Some climbers raged, some wept, some thanked Ethan without meeting his eyes. Business managers argued quietly near satellite phones. Sherpa teams spoke in low voices, serious and restrained. And then, late that afternoon, Arjun arrived at base camp alive. Ethan saw him from across the ice, walking slowly, supported by two Sherpa. Arjun's face was hollow, eyes sunken, but he was breathing. He was still a person, not a story. Arjun looked up when Ethan approached. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Arjun said, voice ragged, "I thought I was going to stay up there." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of what the young man meant. "You didn't." Arjun swallowed, eyes shining with exhausted fear. "That thing, that place, people told me not to look." Ethan put a hand lightly on Arjun's shoulder, steadying him. "Next time someone tells you not to look," Ethan said quietly, "ask why." Arjun nodded once, slowly, like a lesson had been burned into him. That evening, the liaison officer photographed the satellite device. The message was documented. Names were written down. Dates were compared. Reports were filed. It didn't feel like justice, not yet, but it felt like Matteo Caro had finally been given something he hadn't had in 10 years. A voice. Ethan returned to his tent as wind nudged the nylon, and the ice beneath the camp creaked in its endless glacial language. He lay back, eyes open in the darkness, and for the first time since arriving, his mind stopped racing. Everest still stood above them, unchanged, indifferent, ancient. But somewhere on that face, a red tag fluttered as a warning instead of a rumor, and for now at least the cold had not claimed another name. Not today.